I'm Tom Clark, and this is the Halifax International Security Forum. People are here from 70 countries around the world, all sharing the same concern, and that is the future of democracy, peace, and war in what appears to be a changing environment. Now, this discussion happens just 2 weeks after the election of Donald Trump. In fact, this is the first major forum to be held since that seismic event in the United States. And there are a lot of questions on the table. The future of international security alliances, the future of trade, the future of human migration, and of course, as always, the future of what happens in the Middle East. So much to talk about, so let's get going. And General Vance, I'm tempted to say that we should all be very happy that both the Canadians and the Americans have retired their plans for invasion of each other's countries. So there is no playbook to go on. But we're talking about international alliances. You know, Canada, like so many other countries, base their planning and their mission readiness on the basis of a multilateral response and a multinational approach to defense and security. If that starts to fray, if that comes under question, what happens to a coordinated security response, say, to Russia? If there's a disagreement on the international instruments that we have to do that.
Well, thanks, Tom. I think that the advent of multilateral military operations and alliances in many forms, most recently coalitions of the willing, are largely a function of necessity. It's not just an ideology. Most of the conflicts that we're involved with in the world today, those ones that are enduring, those ones or that have endured for some time, and the new ones, demand more than what any one country can do by itself, or even a block of countries. So as we see, as you're pondering the relevance or perhaps the concerns about where multilateral military operations will go, I think we need to think at the very sort of fundamental foundation of why we do this. It's because we have to. And as long as we continue to have to, I think that the mechanisms to put those operations together, coalitions of the willing, alliances, or what have you, will be designed purposefully for the job that they need to do.
Welcome back to the West Block at the Halifax International Security Forum. I want to go over to Hassan Haqqani. Mr. Haqqani works with the Hudson Institute now. You were the former Pakistani ambassador to the United States. I want to add another plate to this table that we're laying out. Nobody could have missed during the campaign the comments that Donald Trump was making about Muslims, about either banning them outright from coming into the United States or putting them under some sort of registry. He's walked that policy backwards and forwards more than once or twice. But in terms of the broader Muslim world, and especially where it intersects with security, what effect is that going to have?
The harm has already been done. Half of politics is, only half of politics is policy. The rest of it is emotion and sentiment. We've seen sentiment unleashed in the United States. A similar sentiment has been unleashed in the Muslim world as well. So you have ISIS celebrating the fact that you have somebody who positions the United States as an enemy of the Muslims because that's what they want. And I think that one of the biggest healing acts that President Trump and his team can do is to actually go back to a position where there are Muslims who are recognized as America and the West's allies. Minister Sajjan here represents a very interesting and unique phenomenon. He's a man in a turban with a brown face like mine, who is the National Defense Minister of Canada. And Canadians don't think the heavens have fallen because he's different to them. I think that in the United States, forces have been unleashed which have asserted the idea, and by the way, we saw that in Britain and we are seeing it in other European countries, that if people are different from us, then they are necessarily on the side of the enemy, and I think that is not a good thing.
I would like to ask anybody else who might want to join this discussion, just raise your hand. I'm happy to come over and talk to you. Particularly, I want to talk about the future of not only what we were talking about in terms of European relations between the West and Russia, not only the Muslim situation, but Ambassador, let me tap you on this. The whole idea, we've left out one big region, and of course that's Asia Pacific. And so fill in the picture, if you can, of what this, let's call it instability for right now, means for that part of the world.
Well, let me make the connection. You know, when we look at the aggression of Russia, and you look at the issue of their aggression in Ukraine, far too often we're looking at it in a very isolated way. It's like, well, it's just on Europe, and that's you know, it's happening and playing out in Europe. It was striking to me at the very time when there was the aggression in eastern Ukraine and the illegal annexation of Crimea. There were a lot of reports out in Asia, in Japan and in Korea, about what was going on. And the reason why was because there was an abrogation of the Budapest Memorandum. We forget Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for the protection of their territorial integrity and sovereignty. And there was an expectation of accountability here. Well, the articles out in Asia were playing out. What will that mean for us in terms of extended nuclear deterrence?
Welcome back to the West Block, coming from the Halifax International Security Forum. I have with me Rose Gottemoeller, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Well, you've had a heck of a couple of weeks, haven't you?
We have.
Listen, let me ask you very simply. Is NATO obsolete, like the President-elect says?
Well, actually, Secretary Jens Stoltenberg and President-elect Trump had a great conversation today, and they talked about the future of the NATO alliance and the future of the relationship between the United States and NATO. And both agreed that that we have work to do in the NATO alliance, just as our panelists have been talking about the necessity of burden sharing being spread across the alliance, but that we also have important missions going forward. I wanted to get in on your discussion a moment ago of the role of peacekeeping. NATO focuses actually on two important missions now. One is deterrence and defense, as we are now bringing our forces to bear to counter aggressive Russian action in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. But also, it focuses on projecting stability. And projecting stability has an important role in that it ensures that in the future we prevent terrorist threats from coming not only to Europe, but also to Canada and to the United States as well. So going forward, it's part of NATO's DNA to look at both of those kinds of threats, the immediate necessity of deterrence and defense, and also the necessity of tackling security problems that may dog us in the future.
Well, let me throw at you, though, the comment that the ambassador made, and it's simply this, that the Kremlin is watching our response to things. So it's watching what we did in Ukraine or what we didn't do in Ukraine. It's watching what we're doing in Eastern Europe. Particularly right now, it is monitoring very closely the comments of the incoming administration and what it may do to NATO. Is this questioning that's going on now materially hurting the alliance?
I think it's driving the alliance closer together. What I see in Brussels, and I've only been on this job 5 weeks, so I'm a newbie in this job, but what I see is that it is driving the alliance closer together and really making countries focus on this necessity of further expenditure on defense. I can't say we've completely reversed the trend, but this year, for the first time in a long time, we're going to have a 3% increase in defense spending across all the countries of the alliance. Some countries haven't stepped up to that 2% requirement of GDP that's really deep in NATO's policy documents. But nevertheless, across the alliance, we've got a 3% increase, and that's a good step in the right direction.
You wouldn't necessarily disagree with the idea, though, that many countries who are paying maybe 1% of GDP should actually pull out the checkbook and write it up, right?
Correct. People have to pull up their socks in many capitals. I don't dispute that at all, but I think people have gotten the message as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think what we've been talking about for the past little while underlines the necessity, especially at this point, of smart, informed discussion about those very basic questions that we laid out right at the beginning, which was the future of everything from democracy, peace, and war going ahead in a changing environment. I want to thank the panel, Harjit Sajjan, Minister of Defense. Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, thank you so much, and General John Vance, good to have you here. And thank you for all of your thoughtful comments. I have a feeling we'll be having this conversation every day for maybe the next 4 or 5 years.